These hills, forests, oceans are the basis of our existence. But we all know the challenges we face. How we use what the planet provides, how we choose to live our lives, will determine the future, our future. The science is clear. The way we feed humanity needs to change. More than 700 million people don't have enough to eat. Billions cannot afford a healthy diet, leading to undernutrition, obesity, and other severe health problems. Our current food systems are responsible for river pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, wasted resources, and a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. Our food systems are destroying more value than they create. We stand at a crossroad. Continue as now, or choose a different path. A path towards a better future. A future shaped by common goals, adapted to local challenges. Changing the way we produce, transport, eat, and waste our food is urgently needed and offers enormous economic benefits. This change is possible, grounded in science, and envisioned by leading economists and researchers.
Was a super year for food systems science and evidence, with an avalanche of groundbreaking reports. Eat Lancet combined human and planetary health considerations for the very first time, showing how 10 billion can be fed healthy diets within planetary boundaries by 2050. The FOLU Growing Better report outlined 10 critical transitions to make it happen, with initial rough estimates on the cost of action versus inaction. Later that year, Johan Rockström, Jeremy Oppenheim, and I, we had many long conversations about what it would take to get or to give policymakers the courage to act fast. The Stern Review in 2006 had a major impact. It really shifted the narrative around climate change, framing it not only as an environmental issue, but as an economic one. And it helped making climate a central issue in economic planning and policy, both at the national and the international level. So, inspired by this report, FOLU, PIC, and EATS embarked on a mission to convene the world's best and most brilliant economists and experts to rigorously model the economic impacts of food systems transformation and provide decision makers with evidence-based guidance on navigating the political economy of food. With generous support from our donors, welcome the IKEA Foundation, Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Quadrature Climate Foundation, the Food Systems Economics Commission, FSEC, was born. Under the leadership of our three brilliant co-chairs, Vera Songwe, Ottmar Edenhofer, and Ravi Kanbur, commissioners from 19 global institutions have been working tirelessly for the past 4 years to crunch the numbers. It has not been easy, that would be an understatement, but our FSEC director and policy lead, Katerina Ruggeri-Laderchi, she steered the commission to the finish line with incredible stamina, grace, and relentless effort. So thank you. So, where you really should clap, today we are proud to share the timely findings of the FSEC Global Policy Report, both as a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity for world leaders and as a contributor to navigating very difficult political challenges around the world. I will, in a minute, leave the mic to our fantastic moderator, Martin Frick, who will guide you through today's program. But as you listen to our speakers, remember this. Yes, it is possible, in theory, to feed a growing world population enough healthy food without destroying our planet, and do so in an inclusive, equitable way. And yes, we do have the money. And yes, we now have the roadmap to do so. It won't be easy, but we simply cannot afford to fail. It's time more people, more leaders accept that healthy and sustainable food is not only an absolute necessity, but also the investment opportunity of the century. We finally got the numbers to prove it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gunhild, and welcome to the launch of the Global Policy Report of FSEC. My name is Martin Frick. I'm leading the WFP office here in Berlin, and I lost a couple of hair over the food systems transformation that is needed. And this is why I'm really happy to moderate this event today, particularly because we have an all-star setup here. My notes say be firm with timing. We are already 3 minutes late, so I'm firm with myself, and I will just introduce the first part of the event and coming to the second part, our panel, in a moment. What you should know is that after these presentations, there will be roughly 10 minutes time, 2 times for your questions. So if anything is there where you really want to know more, there will be possibility for you to speak. Let us kick off the presentation now with Ravi and Vera. Ravi Kanbur and Vera Songwe are 2 of the 3 co-chairs of FSEC, and they will introduce the report and give you an insight behind the methodology. Without much ado, Ravi and Vera, you have the floor. Relax for a bit. So we can do it
together. No, thank you. You can hear us. Since we have a time constraint, we will dive deep into it. But before we go, I wanted to say that we will clap for you, Gunhild, because it always takes a woman to do these things. And yes, we have Johan and with you, but really, thank you, Gunhild, for being there all the time. So thank you so much. And of course, Katerina is somewhere in the thing. So yes, we have the numbers, we know what's needed. Really, we're building off of a lot of work that has taken place, but I think importantly, as we all know, getting some numbers, putting things in a frame is an important first step to beginning to have the debate. And as we have the debate, as Gunhild said, it's been 4 years. Within these 4 years, we went through COVID, we went through all kinds of things, so we will adjust a few things. But I think the main messages will stay the same. And this report really has brought together an incredible amount of people, passionate scientists, economists, food systems specialists to get to where we are today. There's 3 of us, Ravi, Ottmar, and myself, that had the privilege of being the co-chairs. And one of the first things we did when we started this was to say, what if we disagree? What should we do? And we agreed that even if we disagreed, we will put our disagreements in the report, which is why I think the report is much better and much stronger for it, because you see a variety of views from across different continents and different spaces. But we're really happy to be here today again because that debate has started. It is necessary, it is important, it is critical that we continue to feed the globe, and we will continue to do it. But the question is, can we do it differently? Can we do it better? Can we do it in a way where we all come out with a win-win solution? And I think this is what the report does. The report shows us that going the way we're going, yes, we're feeding the world, but we're losing 15 trillion. If we were able to modify what we're doing, and I don't know if slides are coming up, and I'm hoping that they are. Oh, I'm supposed to be the one who's doing the slides. There you go. Okay. Those are the slides. So those are all the commissioners who came together to do the work. You know most of them, and many of them are in the room and have traveled far and wide to be with us today. So thank you so much for being here. Transforming the food system is necessary, possible, and hugely beneficial, but it's not easy. It's going to be difficult. It's political at the end of the day. It's a budget line in every budget, in every household. Deciding what to eat is a big decision. Imagine when you take it to the government level and when you take it to the international level. It is a political decision, even for WFP, by the way. And so, but we know that difficult political decisions have been made and continue to be made. And so we can actually go from what is a potentially a gloomy future to something that is much better. And as Gunhild said again, when we're talking about the food systems, if we do nothing with the food systems and do everything we needed to do with climate, we still hit the planetary boundaries. So we must do something with the food systems. And I think this is why this conversation today is very important. I'm going quickly. If we continue doing what we're doing, 8.6 gigatons of new emissions into the system, and that's precisely the point. If we did everything we needed to do with the climate side, but didn't do anything on the food side, we will still get into trouble. If we decided to do what we are doing on the food systems transformation, which is the green part, and I think, I don't know how to point at it, oh, but you can see, sorry, I'm going backwards. Okay, forget that. You see the sort of carbon sink. The minute we go from the pink to the green, it means we're getting better. The FST means food systems transformation. And the food system transformation essentially means 4 things. We need to change our diets, we need to change our livelihoods, we need to change the way the biosphere works, the way we produce, how we take care of the peatlands, for example. And finally, the production systems, nitrogen, how we can do differently. Do we need to use as much fertilizer? Can we change to more nature-based fertilizer? So those are some of the menus that we can do. And as we do that, we have a very beautiful graph in the report that shows you, what will happen if we did the dietary change as the biggest part and the biggest component that needs to change. What will happen if we did something on livelihoods, essentially changing incentives and giving more incentives for people to demand and consume better. What will happen if we change the production patterns, and what will happen if we change livelihoods. So that's essentially, we know how to do it. We know what the benefits are. As I said, 15 trillion we're losing today. We will be able to save 5 to 10 trillion if we went on the better path by spending somewhere between $200 to $500 billion every year to change the path. Of course, We provide a menu because this is, we're talking to the 9 billion people that we feed, we're talking to the planet, different decisions and policy making decisions that have to be made in different stratospheres. In some places it's more food, in some places. Today we have an interesting statistic in the report, about 770 people that are obese, and it costs $11 trillion in healthcare. When people ask where are we getting the 15 trillion from, $11 trillion of healthcare, because we have high blood, diabetes, and all the associated healthcare impacts that come with it. We could actually reverse some of that. So 770 obese, 730 on the malnourished. We can fix this, and we have the resources and we know how to do it, and I think this report begins to lay the framework for how we can do that. But again, it's not one size fits all. There's a $10 trillion payoff on the other side if we did this well. And it's not just this $10 trillion payoff, there's also the external side, which means we get into the climate, we get into using energy better, we get into protecting the climate and the planet even more. But we have to make policy decisions. Remember in the beginning we said it's not easy. It's never going to be easy, but I think with the numbers that we have put forward, with the examples of some of the good practices across the world, from Africa to Latin America to Asia that are in the report, we see that it's possible, and we see that people can come behind the good results as we begin to make them better known and engage in a dialogue. So I'm going to hand over to Ravi to talk about the difficult political part and how, of course, he has all the answers to how you solve political conundrums. So over to you, Ravi.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Vera. So just to start again at the beginning, what the core model of FSEC does is that it looks at the evolution from 2020 to 2050 along two paths. One you might call the business as usual path, and the other you'd call the food system transformation path, the current trends in the food system transformation path. And the question is, what's the economic gain of moving from the current trends to the food system transformation path? The monetary equivalized gain. And the answer is $5 to $10 trillion per year, annualized, okay? Relative to the 200 billion to 500 billion that it would cost you to actually implement that per year. So you can, it's a ratio of 1 to 10 at least, okay? So that's the magnitude of economic gain that we're talking about. But how do you do it? How do you get onto that path? And here the report has a whole chapter discussing different categories of policies. Of course, we won't have time to get into details, but here are some of the sorts of broad headings under the policies. One would be repurpose. Let me take it in a slightly different order to what's there on the slide. Changing policy incentives through taxation. For example, taxation of carbon, taxation of nitrogen, and so on. But, and we'll come back to that, you have to be careful how you use the resources that you raise from the taxation. That's important to getting political buy-in. The second broad category that we talk about is repurposing agricultural subsidies and food is for them to be targeted towards the production and the consumption of healthy food. And there are very specific examples and specific propositions in the report, which I don't have time to go into. The third broad category is to encourage healthier and more sustainable diets. And again, we have specialists on the Commission who address this. And let me be very clear that there's no one-size-fits-all diet for everybody and so on. Of course, there are guidelines and recommendations, but the idea is to start a conversation where each country on its own starts a discussion for its local conditions, its local cultural context, as how to shift diets towards a healthier direction, okay? In the context of these broad scientific frame. The fourth category of policies is investing in innovation to develop new technologies and actually spread existing technologies. For example, remote sensing, in-field sensors, market access apps, a whole range of things which can actually improve production, improve the productivity of small farmers, and move us towards sustainable agricultural production. And the fifth category, and it's very important for FSEC, because this is one of our guiding principles, is to ensure that no one is left behind. The inclusion lens is a very important lens for FSEC, and that's actually one of the reasons why many of us signed on to this particular enterprise. So many of the policies that are being suggested and recommended will indeed may indeed have short-term negative consequences for certain sections of the population. And we can't deny that, and we'll come back to that when we talk about the politics of it. That cannot be denied. But what we have to have is bundles of policies which complement these other policies to actually protect the poorest. And we take that argument very seriously in this report. That includes direct subsidies and support for poor farms, targeted investment in productive infrastructure, skills and finance for the most vulnerable, particularly women farmers, and so on. So the inclusion lens is extremely important for us, and as important as the other four categories of policy. So, and we have lots of specifics in the report. So let me just ask, if we know all these good things to do, why aren't they being done already? Okay, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, if you buy what we're saying, if you buy the expertise of this group, and if you agree that what we're saying is the right thing, why isn't it being done? Okay, why isn't it being done? And the answer is, of course, that there are resistances. We've already talked about the inclusion dimension. We've already talked about about being careful when our recommendations, at least in the short term, might negatively impact the poor. If they do, then it's ethically right. It's ethically right for us to address that issue. But it's also maybe politically smart for us to address that issue, because doing it that way, you move that from the opponents column into the supporters column for any particular policy reform. Well, what happens if the losers are actually rich and powerful? I won't name names, but what happens if that happens? And that's the nature of the resistance. Well, again, the report doesn't shy away from that discussion. The report takes that on head on and looks at examples around the world where, in fact, precisely those sorts of issues have been tackled. So just to give you three categories of things. One is that, very straightforward, and you'll understand this, public information. To get reports like this out, to get the benefits of this
the current trends scenarios, finds the difference, and then turns that difference into a money value. And that rests on directly modelling how individuals obtain income, environment, and health in different scenarios, and directly aggregating that across individuals. The bottom-up approach separately accounts for the gross benefits and gross costs of the FST item by item, multiplying physical flows by market or shadow prices. And the difference between the gross benefits and the gross costs is an alternative estimate of the net economic benefit of the FST. Now, these two approaches are conceptually fully coherent. Okay? In an ideal world with no uncertainties, they should yield exactly the same answer. But operationally, in practice, they face different challenges, they have different strengths and weaknesses. Our view was that if we pursued both approaches, we would hopefully come up with an estimate of the value of the food system transformation that would be somehow more robust. And as you'll see, indeed, the two approaches deliver reassuringly similar results. So what you can see here is the evolution over time of the gross benefits of the FST, and these are from the bottom-up approach. The gross benefits of the FST are the hidden costs of the food system avoided by shifting from current trends to the FST scenario. They comprise avoided greenhouse gas emissions, avoided habitat destruction from land use change, avoided nitrogen pollution, and avoided health costs from undernourishment and overconsumption. You can see that they grow over time from about $500 billion a year currently to more than $5 trillion in 2050. Environmental benefits accrue quickly, but health benefits slowly become the largest element. Overall, environmental and health benefits are worth roughly equal amounts when aggregated across the whole period. Now, take the flow of benefits that you can see here, add it all up, and then annuitize it so that we have a number we can comprehend, a number that we can, for example, compare with global GDP, and we get to around $5 trillion a year in gross benefits. Separately, we estimated gross costs an order of magnitude smaller, at between 0.2 and 0.5 trillion a year. So roughly speaking, we can say the net economic benefits of the transformation are $5 trillion a year on the bottom-up approach. And that's where the 5 number that you saw earlier in the 5 to 10 range, that's where that comes from. This slide shows you the net economic benefits of the food system transformation as calculated by the top-down approach. So these numbers are net, okay? These are net present values, annuitized, so the number is comparable with the $5 trillion a year estimate from the bottom up. And if you add the environment and health benefits according to the top-down approach, you get to an estimate that is very similar to the estimate coming out of the bottom-up approach. In this case, it's $6 trillion a year, comprising $3.7 trillion a year of environmental benefits and $2.3 trillion a year of health benefits. But in addition, with the top-down approach, we can account for changes in incomes due to the food system transformation across the whole income distribution. Now, these income changes include boosts to income from higher wages and government transfers, as well as the effects of changing food production costs and spending. These are valued at around $4 trillion a year, taking the overall net benefit of the FST to almost $10 trillion a year. So there's where the 10 number comes from, in the 5 to 10 range. Okay. Lastly, another thing that we could do with the top-down approach is that instead of just looking at the food system transformation altogether, we could unbundle it into different packages of measures focusing on different aspects of the transformation. Okay, so you can see 4 different bundles of policies here which collectively make up the food system transformation. Diets, livelihoods, biosphere, and production. And this slide shows that the bundle of measures targeted at shifting diets by itself achieves 70% of the overall impact of the food system transformation, roughly equivalent to a 5% increase in global GDP in 2020. A dietary shift not only produces direct health benefits in terms of avoided morbidity and mortality from overconsumption and undernourishment, but it also alleviates environmental pressure on the production and supply side, lowering greenhouse gas emissions and reducing habitat destruction. Okay, so that's the end of my 6-minute slot. I hope I kept more or less to time, and I'm happy to hand over again to Martin. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you so much, Sam. Shows the enormity of the potential benefits is, of course, just the mirror of the incredible inefficiency of the current system that we are seeing. We will now dig a little bit deeper in the health benefits of changing diets, and I would like to invite Stella on the floor. Stella, microphone is yours.
Thanks very much, Martin. So Simon ended on that point that 70% of the benefits of food system transformation could come from dietary change alone. How is that possible? It works because diets are this powerful confluence where consumer choices can have profound effects on not only themselves and those consumers' own health, but also on food supply chains and through that on the entire food system. To understand how exactly that works, it's helpful to consider a bit, what do we mean when we say adopt a healthy diet, and how far are we from that currently? As Ravi mentioned, what a specific healthy diet looks like varies widely all around the world according to different cultural traditions, agroeconomic conditions, various variations in which foods are available and desirable in a given culture and place. But the general principles that guide a healthy diet do not. A healthy diet is rich in nutrients like vitamins, minerals, proteins, and those are derived from nutritious foods like fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. And it limits harmful substances like free sugars, excess sodium, and ultra-processed foods. Unfortunately, the diets that we currently eat are a long way from that right now. Nearly everybody is not eating enough fruits and vegetables or legumes. In some parts of the world, people rarely eat nutrient-dense animal source foods, and when they do so only in small amounts, contributing to micronutrient deficiencies. In other parts of the world, those foods are eaten to excess. And ultra-processed foods, dense in calories and poor in nutrients, fill people up without nourishing them in every region of the world. This has massive negative health consequences. Diet-related illness is responsible for 8 million deaths annually. And diet-related causes are among several of the top 10 contributors to the global burden of disease. This also comes with major economic costs. But the good news is that we can flip that on its head. Eating a healthy diet is one of the single most impactful ways to control these risks and help avoid long-term illness. And the FSEC modeling does just that. It assumes a scenario in which all people everywhere gradually adopt by 2050 a healthy diet, based on the principles of the diet developed by the Eat Lancet Commission. As Ravi mentioned, this is not one size fits all. In many regions of the world, this implies an increase in fruits, vegetables, legumes consumption. In many parts of the world, it also entails a decrease in consumption of animal source foods like meat and dairy. But consumption of those foods actually needs to increase in some places, notably sub-Saharan Africa, because diets would be healthier as a result, and that could contribute to a reduction in micronutrient deficiency. And these changes would have profound effects on human health, as is shown here. Could eliminate undernutrition, cut diet-related healthcare costs, and save 174 million lives by 2050. But the effects don't end with human health. When people eat less of X and more of Y, the food supply chain needs to realign along that to bring those foods to those consumers that are demanding it. When that happens at a population level, you can see profound shifts. For example, if global diets transition towards those where in many regions people are eating less meat, that means there's lower demand for livestock. Having fewer livestock means there's less need for feed and fodder for those livestock. That frees up land from producing that feed and serving as pasture. That results in less use of water, greater coverage of forests. Those forests foster increased biodiversity, and they help to sequester carbon. That carbon sequestration combines with the direct reduction in carbon emissions greenhouse gas emissions coming from reduction in enteric fermentation from production of livestock to result in lower greenhouse gas emissions overall that help to limit global warming and enable us to achieve our global targets under the Paris commitments. So dietary change is this really powerful lever for shifting the food system. But of course, when we say we just need to change diets, that's glossing over a really big fact that changing diets is really, really hard. Dietary choices are deeply ingrained in cultures, in habits, and in preferences. And when it's easy to speak of them and think of them as individual choices, they're actually not. They're largely shaped by systemic factors that are beyond the control of individuals. Many people live in places where they face limited availability, affordability, desirability of nutritious foods, while at the same time they're surrounded by pervasive availability and aggressive marketing of unhealthy foods, which are engineered to be particularly desirable and essentially irresistible to consume. So all of those factors, they're not controllable by individuals, and they're influenced by powerful commercial interests all the way along the food value chain. So we need to focus on ways to shift these systemic factors through incentives, innovation, and investment. First, we need to think about how can we better incentivize a food system to provide healthy diets by taxing unhealthy foods, subsidizing healthy ones, redeploying agricultural subsidies from production that is not good for human health or planetary health towards things that are. Regulating food marketing, leveraging public procurement as a powerful way to shift demand, and using front-of-pack labels on food to nudge consumers to make healthier choices. We need innovation that can support nutritious foods and make them desirable in ways that don't harm the environment. We need investment to support this innovation and strengthen productivity and make healthy diets accessible to all. These are all promising avenues, but the truth is that we don't know enough about what works, where, and at the scale that's really needed to bring about the type of food system transformation that we need. So we need more experimentation, we need more research to understand that, and to identify more of these evidence-based integrated solutions that are good for people as well as planet. But that will only come once we recognize how important changing diets truly is for bringing about the food system transformation. Thank you.
Stella, thank you so much. We just had one of the biggest industry shows about food in this city, the Grüne Woche. And if the state minister would be here, unfortunately, she is ill, she would wholeheartedly agree with you that it's necessary, but it's not easy. But you also spoke about the environmental benefits, and who better than Naoko Ishii to walk us through the environmental benefits of changing our food systems and taking to heart the recommendations of the report. Naoko, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me here. In fact, the invitation to work for this commission is almost a kind of dream initiative, because all of us who care for the planet all know that we are so much out of balance of the planetary capacity and the way that our current economic system is kind of operating. Johan always reminded us that we already exceeded the 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. And if we really want to continue to thrive within the planetary boundaries, we seriously need to think how to transform the current economic system, and food system is maybe the most important system to transform, because it really touched upon almost 9, or at least 6 of those planetary boundaries we have already exceeded. So that I want to talk about that, if we want to do this FST, food system transformation, what would be the result? And we were very happy to present to you. We finally got the number right. So that the remarkable result would be that this food system, which is currently actually responsible for almost 1/3 of the GHG emission, can be actually the carbon sink by 2040. That is remarkable. And of course, it needs a lot of investment and deforestation, afforestation, and all over the world. But the major benefit would be maybe Brazil and Latin America. They become the world's largest carbon sequestration on this planet. The benefit is also China and Sub-Saharan Africa, which is also the good news. And if we also do that, an adoption of the more sustainable food production, it will reverse the biodiversity loss, which will be particularly clear in the Brazil, Latin America, and even China. And the more sustainable food production also will have the nitrogen surplus, particularly in China, which is exceedingly good news. But all of this together, and also together with other fundamental system transformations, such as energy system transformation, we can really hit this Paris target of 1.5 degrees by the end of this century, which is so important. As already previous speaker mentioned, that the climate change, energy transition on its own cannot really achieve that livable planet, and we need to really bring that energy transition, the food system transformation, other economic transformation together. So then the question ahead of us, how we can really make it happen? All the previous speakers emphasized it's not easy, but how we can really do it. Here, maybe I start with maybe a more simple part of the solution that it's already also mentioned by that more shift to the more sustainable the food production. which, some of which have been already operated on the ground. For instance, to adopt the rotation of a wider range of crops, or conservative tillage, or even the precision agriculture really helps us to move towards the more sustainable food production. But the fundamental action lever I want to emphasize is actually how we can really find a way to put the real price, the full value of the natural capital. I think Simon mentioned when he calculated cost benefit of food system transformation, he mentioned in the current market system, the food or natural capital or environment he mentioned hasn't really have a full price or that the full value in the market system. So that is a kind of fundamental the challenge that we are facing. Whenever we try to address this hidden costs, unless we find a way to reveal or surface those hidden cost facts, we continue to have this hidden cost calculation. So there are good news is that there are some good example of how to do it. So if we could do this and moving towards that accounting for the full value of the natural capital of nature, there are two things which could happen. One, we can penalize the bad thing, that which the economists call that how to internalize externalities. I think Ravi already mentioned that how to tax that carbon emission, that we can also tax that the nitrogen surplus. So there are a way to penalize or to put a price on those external bad. That's one way of addressing this issue. But the second way of addressing issue is how we can really reward the good thing. So that is maybe a little bit more challenging. Again, that there are some good examples already ongoing, like a PES, payment for ecosystem services. It's basically linking that the ecosystem service and the producer of it and the user of it along the same the line. And but in order for us to do it with a scale, we need a leader like Costa Rica, even China is doing it, to do it more like on a national or subnational scale. But another good example of that this rewarding the good deed is like an REDD plus. And we have had a lot of enthusiasm during the COP28 and Davos that the booming, that in a voluntary carbon market. Now we talk about the nature credit, water credit, biodiversity credit. These are all kind of attempts to how to reward the good deed through market mechanism. But again, these are still very much fragmented, the project by project basis. We need to really shift that this action lever to much more scalable with the speed, and maybe this may link to how to even change the accounting system, but that maybe goes beyond this and the scope. But all in all, if we are able to really shift this kind of lever, that we are able to reward that planetary guardians or the guardians who are actually holding that natural capital, who they are predominantly in global south, smallholder farmers, forest community, indigenous community, the fisherman's village. And these are the ones who are holding that or safeguarding the global commons or natural capital without really economically not being rewarded. So if we move to those kind of system, that we should be able to reward those kind of good deed, and that is actually very much already two co-chairs emphasized. We need to be inclusive. We need to address this increasing division between north and south. So this way, I think that we can really shift the transform the food system for the health of the people, health of the planet, and also address this vulnerability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naoko. And your second slide was certainly a stark reminder that one of the ecosystem services provided is also beauty, which you lose in monoculture and wrong ways of agriculture. But you spoke about inclusion, and we always say food systems is the biggest everything, including being the biggest employer. And the poorer you are, the more directly you are in a relationship with the land. Before I hand over to Jo Swinnen, who will speak exactly about that, here's a little reminder that after Jo, we have 10 minutes for your questions and answers from the people you heard so far, and then we transition into a really extraordinary panel. So stay with us and prepare your questions. But for now, Jo, you have the last presentation on inclusion and political economy.
Thank you very much, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. Also from my side, a big thank you for getting me involved in this exercise. This was it's been a pleasure. It was a pleasure for me, but of course the issues we're dealing with is not really a pleasure for the world. The issues I'm going to talk about particularly on the political economy side, are very hot and timely, I would say. Actually, they're so hot that this morning when I was at breakfast, going through my notes, I hadn't realized there was a flame on the table, and actually my notes literally went up in flames. So I had to of course, I hadn't forgotten anything I was going to say, but I think a great contribution and innovation of the FSEC report is making the issues of inclusion and of political economy explicit in the analysis and a strongly integrated part of the conclusion and the suggestions going forward. And I think that's a major contribution in this thing. What we're facing is obviously a huge challenge. It's a massive transformation of our food system around the world, and that, of course, is difficult, right? We should not, I think nobody underestimates the challenges. Sometimes the opportunities are not sufficiently emphasized, but a large change in anything socially in the world where everybody is involved and everybody is affected, at the same time creates a lot of excitement, but it creates a lot of resistance because people are scared, they may be negatively affected, etc. Actually, I have a slide which Katrina made for me, which kind of summarizes the very actual issue on what is currently going on in Europe. We are at the same time having a lot of protests from the farmers mostly. Today they're blocking. This is a picture from Berlin, from the Brandenburger Tor, but also what's going on today. They're blocking Brussels and Paris, and they've been in other countries protesting that we're going too fast and too deep, if you want, and at the same time here is the Mona Lisa, which received some soup today or yesterday from protesters who think we do not go far enough and fast enough. And so these things are very much at the heart of what we're discussing. Now, a question we should ask is, why are these reforms so difficult? Okay, if everybody thinks that the ultimate goal is really very important, not just worthwhile, but really, really important, that has been documented very well in the rest of the report. There's some common factors, I think, why reforms in general are always difficult, but there's also very specific factors for this particular transition. A common characteristic of many reform attempts is that there's typically a disequilibrium between the costs and the benefits. Typically, the costs of reforms are concentrated, are perceived by those who are negatively affected as being quite clear, and they are imminent. At the same time, benefits often are dispersed, so many people benefit from them, but the costs are a bit everywhere. They are perceived as more uncertainty, actually, how people may benefit, and typically they're longer term. Okay, so these are things which are a lot of different reforms that we are facing are, they are characteristics of that. And the imminent versus longer term is not only affected how people react to it, but of course also how policymakers react to it if they face election cycles, etc. An additional factor I think particularly important here is the international dimension. So a lot of the decisions that have to be made, the changes that have to be made are at the local level, at the national level, but of course a lot of the implications are at the global level. So that adds to the complications of the reforms and to the increase in resistance to the reforms. Another point I think is if we compare it to traditional, I would say, agricultural reform, both in the global north and the global south, what we're asking now, what we're targeting is much more complex. So we're targeting a more healthy system, a more environmentally sound system, a more resilient system, and inclusive systems. And that complexity has several implications. The complexity makes that the identification of the win-win, of the trade-offs, etc., is difficult, okay? If you can see all the modeling work that has gone on, and Simon has summarized some of it, It's complex, right? That also means that identifying packages of reform of policies, including compensation systems, etc., is difficult. It also means that the transition funding for this thing may be complicated, basically sourcing the funding that is needed for very substantial investments that need to take place. The politics kind of reinforce that, the political systems, in the sense that more uncertainty of the cost and benefits tends to increase the resistance and reduce the support, because people in general are risk averse. We also have more actors involved at the negotiations, at the lobbying, at the discussions, etc. But at the same time, our policy institutions, which are dealing with these transitions, are still separated. They're in silos. We have the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Finance, etc. And that means that there's problems of coordination there, again complicating some of the decisions that need to be made. I think also in terms of the international framework is just not as well developed as it should be to make some of these things possible. And this relates to the negotiations on commitments, I think, but also to issues, for example, on mobilizing international finance for making this possible. A third factor is, what are we talking about really? What are we really discussing? We're talking about transformation, but are we talking about the facts? Are we talking about the interest of people, those who are affected negatively, those who benefit? Or are we talking about the values? What we know from what we've learned, what we know from issues is that facts can be, at least theoretically, addressed by getting better information. That's what we're trying to do here today with our report. Interest, we try to identify who's benefit, who's losing. A lot of the model work is done, and then set up compensation systems. But the values is something much more profound. Think about the GMO debate, okay? It looks like whatever evidence we bring to the table, polarization is there. Those who don't like GMOs are going to stick with it. Those who do like it are going to stick with it. And to some extent, I think some values are here at work as well. And that makes coming to an agreed upon transformation policies where everything is buying in much more complicated, okay? It's beyond just interest. It's beyond just impacts, costs and benefits. And that, I think, is crucial to take into account. A final point is that these reforms are not taking place in a vacuum. Now, you all know that, of course, they're in the real world, right? But there's a lot of structural changes taking place in this world, which these reforms are kind of coming on top of that. For example, in Europe, we've seen that the people employed in agriculture, that number has gone down for 60, 70 years, okay? And that is because comparative advantage is effectively shifting away from agriculture into other sectors. So that means if you add different requirements on the sector, this adds to the already structural factors which make agriculture and farming difficult and challenging often. In the Global South, we've seen that since 2015, there's a massive increase in hunger, in conflicts, declines in economic growth. All these things are happening, and this comes kind of course, they're interrelated, but still additional factors come on top of it. And then we've had a series of shocks recently, and these shocks can, at the same time, they can benefit because they can shock the political equilibrium, but at the same time, they can increase uncertainty. People become more conservative sometimes, basically make them less likely to move forward. So what can we do? There's a lot of things. First of all, we have to take these things seriously, I think. Ravi has gone through 5 different strategies which are discussed in the report: building coalitions, new governance arrangements, both domestically and internationally, shaping narratives and providing information, which is what we try to do here today, and with the report in the coming months and years, hopefully we will influence this. Calibrating policies to gain acceptance from key stakeholders. This also has to do with putting bundles of policies together, okay, by that creating more win-win situations, addressing compensation issues, and holding governments and businesses to account. I mean, there's both a measurement issue, where we all can make a contribution, but at the same time an enforcement issue. Okay, how, even if you know they're not living up to their promises, how are you providing incentives, sticks and carrots to make this work? Let me just end by an example of a new and creative coalition, if you want. You know, when we talk about coalition, we often talk about producers and consumers, but they make up only a minority of the value chains of the food systems. I mean, a big chunk is done by other agents in this value chain: retailers, food processing, finance, etc., fertilizers. And they're And coalition formation in these things is very complex. And also today we have that going forward. But there are also very promising signs, I think. For example, in the emerging plant-based food systems, we've seen a lot of growth and new technology of the market, new companies coming in, new investments taking place. And I think that's going to change the dynamics. And just a side point here, this is not only in the global north. I mean, I just did a quick calculation. In the US and Germany together, there's roughly 27 million people who characterize them as vegetarians. In China and India together, there's 500 million people, 500 million people. So there again, I think in terms of transition, we have to look both at the north and the south. And my final point is, I've used up more of my time actually, Mr. Chairman. Example. Okay, we just need to find the right incentive systems for the decision makers, the institutional need to be in place. And for this, I think, for example, working on non-traditional political coalitions is extremely important. And of course, being in Berlin, I was the first time here in 1988. In the summer, I visited Berlin. It was East and West Berlin then. And nobody could predict then that 2 years later the world would be completely different. So it's a great place to launch a report for change for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We share an experience. My first time in Berlin was exactly 4 weeks before the wall fell. And I remember a conversation in East Berlin, somebody telling me, you don't need to take a picture, this thing will last a lifetime. It didn't. We are speaking about transformation in a very complicated context. I'm sure you're brimful with information by now. The next 10 minutes is yours. If you want to ask a question, if you have a comment, if you want to add to anything you've heard, I'm looking at your hands and I have a microphone here which I'm happy to pass on. Please, if you could just quickly introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Oskar Masterlatz. I'm working on planetary health at the Potsdam Institute, and I'm also a research analyst at the German Advisory Council on Global Change. And first of all, thank you for these very interesting presentations. I'm very much looking forward to reading the report. And I have a question on the health quantifications you were talking about. What you didn't mention so far was that avoiding the environmental changes would also have a lot of health benefits because of reducing all the health risks of the environmental changes. And on the other hand, that promoting the healthy diets also would make people a lot less vulnerable to those negative health effects of climate change, for example. And I guess quantifying that would be very hard because there are just not the right models and data yet. But I would be interested in an educated guess if like the positive health benefits of that would even add up a significant amount of saved costs and monetary benefits. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will collect a couple of questions. If there is another one. Let me look at you. Yes, the lady all the way to the right. And maybe in the meantime, I can ask Ravi and Vera and Simon and Stella and Naoko and Yo to come up so we can answer the questions briefly before we go on with the second session. Or I can come to you to answer the question, what works best for you. But please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, I'm very happy to be here today and listen to your presentations. Very impressive. My name is Babette Regira. I'm from the Leibniz Institute of Vegetable and Ornamental Crops, located close here to Berlin. I'm wondering, the food system is already highly complex. And if we are looking for the transformation of the system, you mentioned already the alignment with other transformation processes. So we are probably talking about a higher level of complexity because we also have to align with energy system transformation. In my world, we are always talking about agri-food system transformation. That means not only food system transformation, but adding the entire agricultural system. So how can we address this higher level of complexity?
Thank you very much. And Simon, I'm already looking at you. A third question? Yes, the gentleman in the red sweater in the middle.
Hello, my name is Arthur Unge-Metzger. Agriculture and forestry is not only about food. And when we look at climate change and the transformation that is required, we also look at materials, we look at substances for industry, also at the energy system. How was that taken into consideration? Because that is competing land uses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Stella, you want to answer the question on the health benefits and the resilience in health system. Let's start with that, and then maybe Simon, I would ask you to answer the complexity question with energy. But please, any one of my former panelists, but also of the upcoming panelists, feel free to answer if you want to come in for one of the questions. Stella.
No, thank you for that. That's an excellent question. I love the reasoning that's behind it about how do we amplify these changes even better. I would not want to hazard a guess about what the actual magnitude of that change would be. I'll leave that to the modelers to see if they can add additional layers of complexity to the already complex model, but definitely it's right in terms of theory. I think the more that we look into the health consequences of climate change, the more we realize just how bad they are, right? Simple things like heat have profound impacts on mortality and morbidity, and they do definitely intersect with nutrition in the sense that people who have micronutrient deficiencies or are overweight and obese are much more vulnerable to those consequences. Also, when we think about the impacts of climate-related disasters, people who are undernourished, much less resilience to deal with that. So I'm quite sure that if we were able to do that modeling, we would see an amplifying effect of looking at, in addition, those indirect effects and see even greater benefits to the food system transformation when we look through those different lenses.
Need the microphone. Thank you very much. Two questions around the complexities in energy transition. Simon, maybe you want to answer those if you step up, or you have a microphone here.
Sure. So, well, actually, if I may just say something about the first question, because some of the environmental benefits that I was mentioning are actually health benefits. Because, for example, in the bottom-up modelling, the social cost of carbon, which is the damages avoided by reducing emissions by 1 tonne, part of that is avoided health impacts of climate change. So actually, they're in there to some, admittedly, unknown extent. Therefore, it's hard to say whether the overall numbers should be higher if these were fully accounted for. As far as complexity is concerned, I mean, you're absolutely right. This is a terribly complex problem. I think perhaps the easiest way to address the question is to talk about how did we try to cope with the complexity and the fact that the food system is embedded within a wider set of systems, including the energy system. And I think the simple answer to that, and I'm kind of looking to my PIC colleagues, is we coupled models together, which enabled us to think about the food system and the energy system and wider development coherently as part of one evolving system. So coupling models is the sort of two-word answer to your question.
Thank you very much. We will have time for more questions in precisely 37 minutes, but the next 30 seconds we'll see a video presentation, and in that time I would kindly ask the panelists of the second part to already come on stage. So now time for the video, please. So, welcome back. Second session with an extremely interesting panel. I do very short introductions because the people on the panel don't need introductions. To my left, we have Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute. Next to him is Marilia Bezerra from the IKEA Foundation. Then Marc Sadler from the World Bank, and Jeremy Oppenheim, founder of SYSTEMIQ. And Jeremy, I know your time is limited, so I would start right away with you. SYSTEMIQ works with the private sector. You've been on these issues for many years. What's your takeaway from this report? How do you believe is the specific angle with private sector working for implementing this report?
Well, Martin, thank you. And I apologize for having to sort of kind of exit stage left in about 8 minutes' time. Three very quick observations on the private sector piece, and let us all recognize that there is no such thing as one homogenous private sector. I mean, there's IKEA, that's part of the private sector. There are all sorts of pieces. That small farmer is also a private sector actor. So let's recognize the complexity there as well. But I'm going to say three things just to kind of cut to the chase. One is that there is no answer to the food system transformation unless we engage with the private sector, right? In all its different forms. They have to be part of the solution. And if we find ourselves consciously or unconsciously looking to explain why they're the villains in the piece, then we will slow down the transition in multiple ways. And there are undoubtedly good actors and less good actors and even some bad actors. But let's find the good actors and let's get behind them and really, if you will, help them, if you will, scale. And some of them are incumbents as well as attackers. So let's be very thoughtful about how do we, and Christiana Figueres would say this if she were here, how do we make this tent big? How do we get, as many, if you will, good actors as we can, and some sitting on the fence together behind the solutions here. That's observation one. Number two, very simply, the private sector is, for all its complexity, it is driven by, carrots and sticks, right? If we set clear, predictable rules that are in line with the science, right, then the private sector will respond. If we send mixed signals, right, or allow political processes to be captured by the private sector and some of the incumbent interests, then we will get the wrong outcomes. So we kind of all know this. The political economy of getting this right is hard, but the core of predictable signals aligned with the science, transparency on numbers so that we can see who's doing the right things and who isn't, and hold actors to account, including public sector actors, many of whom, frankly, are part of the problem as well. Doing that stuff well is the core of how you get this extraordinary thing called the market to do what we need it to do. So that's observation two. And the guidelines and the ideas within the report, which are science-based, which lay out very clearly some of the, if you will, the 5 key areas where we need to see improvement, and they're very clear and specific. Healthy diets, the right environmental stuff, inclusion, resilience. It's not rocket science. Get them turned into, from principle to policy, turn those into clear market signals and good things will happen. Last thing is just to make the obvious and final statement. This is a game of, in the end, mobilizing capital. And the report talks about the $500 billion a year that are needed versus the, somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion of, if you will, benefits. Those $500 billion, as described in the report, are mainly public sector funding mechanisms. They're for rural infrastructure, that's $200 billion, and there's $300 billion that's identified around, if you will, transfer mechanisms on an international public finance basis. That is not natural territory for the private sector, neither of those, let's be clear. But there are $200–300 billion a year of capital that needs to be mobilized and invested into particularly the upstream. When Naoko was rightly talking about investing in, if you will, our natural capital, and that investment needs to happen in a good way, and most of that will be private sector capital. So we've got to find, if you will, the right signals with predictability, and then the right kind of ways of combining private capital with public capital to de-risk through some of the, not completely de-risk, but to appropriately allocate risk, to be precise, through the transition, to get the thing called the private sector to do what we want it to do, which is to be aligned with the science and the fantastic recommendations of this report.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And let me welcome Ajay, who you just seen on the screen coming online. Ajay via Jakhar is the head of the Indian Farmers Forum. And at that point, let me also express apologies for Claudia Müller, State Minister in the Ministry of Agriculture of Germany. She unfortunately became ill, which I think is not a surprise after 2 weeks of Global Forum on Food and Agriculture and a week of Grüne Woche. So, Marc, we just heard about the investment case for public money and the absolute need to leverage that, to bring in public money, to leverage the private sector, what Jeremy just said. How do we do that? Over to you.
The first point I was going to make, it almost sounds like we'd organised ourselves, but I promise you we didn't.
Not true.
Promise you we didn't. Look, one of the statements that's made in the report, I came from the agricultural sector in the World Bank many years ago, so I'm an Aggie deep down. But one of the facts that keeps on being referred to is that agriculture only gets 3% of climate finance, and yet it produces 30% of global emissions. And that's sort of always said in a way that suggests a bit of disappointment. But turn the argument around the other way. The reason why agriculture gets 3% of climate finance is because it's producing 30% of emissions. Why would public money increasingly flow to the production of public bads, when already 500 billion, according to the report, is producing public bads? So what was it that other sectors did that enabled them to start attracting finance, to start the transition towards reducing the public bads and increasing the public goods? And that then really brings you back to some of the questions and the sort of challenges that I put before teams at the bank on a regular basis. And that is that other sectors have engineers. And when I deal with energy sector people, it's very nuts and bolts. It's very clear what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, where they're going to do it, and what I'm going to get for the finance that I put in. And so part of the challenge, I think, for food systems is to come up with this clarity. If you expect the taxpayers of the world, global public finance for climate especially, to finance a food system to be part of the solution, we need to be much, much clearer about what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, how we're going to do it, and what are the upsides that are going to come from that. It's difficult in complex systems, but we need to be very specific. Which takes me to the second point, which is Aggies tend to always think in this huge silo without necessarily looking at other systems. We talk about systems, and I tend to talk much more not about transformations. Transformations generally are slow processes, incremental in their nature. Climate can't wait for transformations of systems. Climate can only get to where we need to be as a planet, and that is 1.5 degrees or less, with fundamental transitions and disruption. For a system that accounts for 30% of emissions, we really do need to be looking at where we're seeing successes in these transitions and drawing from them. And essentially, in very simple terms, you've got a two-sided problem, supply and demand. On the demand side, everyone wants the fatty, salty, quick, I come home, I've got 3 jobs, I now live in an urban conurbation, I need to grab something on my way home, I don't have half an hour to now prepare a healthy food. So that's really difficult. Now we're talking about billions of consumers So go back to the first point. How are we being specific about how we influence the behaviors of billions of consumers? What, where, how, when, what do we get? And then on the supply side, in energy, and I work a lot in the energy space, I wouldn't say it was easy, it's very, very difficult. But we're probably talking at the moment around 5,000 to 10,000 thermal power plants globally. Need to go and have an impact on 5,000 or 10,000 managers with their workforces. Okay, that's relatively straightforward. As you can imagine, the implementation is very complex. Here we're talking about 400–500 million farmers. So what is it that we can do in terms of aggregation? How do you move that model of change into what is a complex system on the supply side? And then two last pieces that I'd add in terms of lessons learned elsewhere. The just transition in coal has consumed billions of dollars, and yet direct and indirect employees related to the coal just transition, globally, no more than 10 million. As we mentioned, 400–500 million farmers. So we're clearly not going to pay for the transition to occur. But what was it? What was one of those biggest things that made the coal transition of today work versus the failures of 20–30 years ago? And we see the same parallel, I think, today in the farmers. And in the, you know, I live in Brussels. Try driving around Brussels today with all the tractors and the angry farmers. What was it 20–30 years ago that made those coal transitions not work? And it was the employees in those coal mines who suddenly went from being heroes to zeros. Being a coal miner in certain countries was a majorly important job. You were providing energy to the economies. They were the heroes, literally, going down the mines every day. And yet, when we look at our farmers, the farmers in Europe, the farmers elsewhere, the feedback I get from them is, hang on a minute, suddenly we were the heroes feeding everyone through the 60s and the 80s, and now all of a sudden we're the zeros, and we're facing all of these implications in legislation. We are the demons of the European Green Deal. So this messaging and approach fundamentally, let's take some of that from the coal transition.
Thanks very much, Marc. Marilia, philanthropy has the advantage of not being heavy and bureaucratic and having money for strategic investments. How do you see this report with your lens on from the IKEA Foundation?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I want to say that I don't sit here alone representing the IKEA Foundation, but I also want to thank our other funders, Quadrature, the Wellcome Trust, Rockefeller Foundation, and IFPRI, because all good things are done collectively. At the IKEA Foundation, we have this not easy mission of caring for people and planet at this moment in time, and through that work, we really get to experience or get to witness the experience of those who are most suffering from or bearing the burden of the very transformation of the very systems we need to shift. So economic systems transformation needs to happen, energy systems transformation needs to happen, and we've seen coal miners, for instance, bearing the burden of that, and same here with food systems transformation. I think one of the things that this report does that is really essential is, first, I mean, it does many things. But I think one first thing that it does that's really essential is that it dispels the narrative of impossibility, that it is not possible to transform food systems. And that alone, then I hope Jeremy won't mind that I'm going to add something to his point around this being a game of mobilizing capital. I think before it is a game of mobilizing capital, it's a game of mobilizing people. And without the right narrative we're not going to be able to mobilize people. And that's why I also want to pick on another thing at the risk of being a little provocative, but the idea of not easy is one that I think we might want to interrogate for ourselves. Not easy for whom, right? At what period or at what moment in this transformation is this not easy for the mother farmer who in 10 years' time will not be able to feed her children because of the effects of climate change in her little subsistence agriculture plot? Or is it not easy for the corporate sector leaders that are going to have to see some of their competitive advantage challenged, through this transition? So maybe we need to examine not easy for whom and separate what is not easy from what's not comfortable. Because if we are really doing what this report sets itself to do, which is to understand the barriers, I think we need to be looking at those dynamics. Those are fundamentally power dynamics. I think the other point I wanted to make, that we also in the philanthropy sector have a role in facilitating is who is not in this room, right? There's a point here, point number 5, about leaving no one behind. But even when we have these conversations, when we decide what's the right narrative, when we decide who needs to be included, and recognizing the shift needs to happen at national level, at local level, but who is missing, and how do we really create the spaces for their inclusion in the conversation? So I think another really important thing that the report has done for us, which helps with the mobilizing people piece, is actually not just talking about all the downside of current state, right, current trends, but it really sets a very clear vision for the future. And as Buckminster Fuller, I think, used to say, if you do want to create systems transformation, you create a new system that makes the old one obsolete. So there is really a blueprint here for what we want. And honestly, you had me at eliminating undernutrition and saving 176 million lives from premature death. I mean, could have stopped right there, right? But there's more. There's, I don't know, 1.4 billion hectares that, we are going to avoid deforestation from, or 200 million reforested, so one biodiversity. So how do we tell the story that this report so clearly brings us in a way that really helps that people mobilization, that will facilitate the mobilization of capital? And then how do we bring the system in the room, the entire system in the room, right? Including corporate sector, farmers, to have these discussions in a way that sets the agenda in a way that truly, truly leaves no one behind.
Thanks very much, and a perfect segue to our last two speakers. And Ajay, before you speak about those not in the room that you are mobilizing, I want to come to Johan. I was just thinking, Johan, I heard you for the first time speaking 16 years ago in a tent in Sweden with a compelling story about planetary boundaries. You've been advocating since then, and with all due respect, politics is slow to listen to science. How do you see an entry point for the scientific findings? And when I'm saying I heard you 16 years ago, not a single thing that you have said proved to be wrong. So we know, and we are on the consistent scientific story that if anything just proves to be too conservative in the estimate, how do we finally get the science into political decision making? Simple question, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And actually, one of my few notes for this little remark is actually conservative. But let me start just with Gunhild's beginning here. I mean, we've been speaking about the broken food system since the EAT Forum was launched. And now we finally have the most authoritative economic assessment ever made, with, I think, the headline, which I really hope that all of us will now spread across the world, that the economic damage of the global food system
exceeds the economic value of the benefit it generates. I mean, that's so dramatic that we now have the analysis done. And what I, in a way, lack perhaps in this enormous accomplishment is exactly your point, Martin, urgency. We know that we just have this decisive decade to turn things around. And it's not only by half. If we do not turn things around on keeping the buffering capacity, the resilience of the Earth system intact, which has all to do with the food system transition on fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus, land, and biodiversity, which exactly this putting numbers behind, we will fail. And this will take us to a point where the analysis done by FSEC will be proven, apart from the dramatic numbers of 10 to 15 trillion US dollars in cost, will be a conservative underestimate, because as soon as you cross tipping points, you're outside of what the economic analysis have been able to quantify. And then you come into irreversible changes, and this can be driven by the food system alone, as Naoko pointed out. So I think that is kind of just one point, the urgency. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is that I think, a bit like if I read you right, Marilia, I think we focus and drown a bit too much in complexity. How complex is it really, and complex for whom? And if you add urgency to the mix, perhaps the complexity paradoxically goes down, because it forces us to recognize that we need some big shifts, some big governance shifts that have to occur universally. I actually, having led the Atlantic Commission together with Walt Willett, kind of disagree that diets are kind of up for anyone to adopt in any way. Science is quite clear here. There's a planetary health diet. This is not a one-size-fits-all for sure, Ravi. That's not the point. The point is that science is quite clear that we as Homo sapiens, we're the same species on this planet, and we have so much scientific evidence today of what gives the best health outcomes for what we eat. Now, that health outcome can be combined in myriads of ways, but the boundary conditions are actually quite set in terms of plant-based diets, fruit, nuts, unsaturated fats, less animal proteins. We know that this is largely a flexitarian diet. It applies to everyone. Everyone can adapt this locally, but the boundary conditions are set. I think, therefore, we need to think much more of top-down, brave governance measures to match the urgency. And that takes me to the point about the food prices. I mean, the pictures here about the farmers on the street, I mean, the farmers are facing tremendous challenges, undoubtedly, but we also know that increased food prices is actually good for farmers. I'm looking forward to that discussion in a little second here. But, you know, we kind of always seem to be portraying this as a massive downside for the farming community in the world, where in fact it can be one of the biggest upsides of all. Who is truly the big loser on the short term may be the consumers, because food prices at the FSEC shows needs to actually rise very significantly once we internalize the externalities. And as Ravi and Vera pointed out, we have social mechanism to sort that out by having compensation schemes for the most vulnerable. So, you know, it's not as if this is, of course it's difficult, but it's certainly not impossible. And we know from the European Union even all the critique that everyone is always posing on the common agriculture policy, but one thing it's trying to do is to shift from productivity-based subsidies to more custodian-based subsidies. And actually it's moving in that direction. So, you know, again, it can be done. And let me just close, Martin, by saying that, you know, on complexity, you know, having worked for many, many years in West Africa, it's quite shocking to see how this entire region has moved quite recently. I mean, we're talking last 2 generations, from resilient, drought-based, drought-proof and healthier millet and sorghum-based system to maize and rice-based cultures. Now, where did that come from? It's completely external, it's completely driven by big industry, and it's a complete violation of local cultures. And you see this in geography after geography after geography, how the globalized, industrial, controlled food system is being manipulated by very few actors who change local cultures. Naoko, we've been talking about how Japan is shifting away from its traditional culture of food into fast food industrial Western cultures of food, and we can go on and have that list for a very long time. Now, that to me is actually a proof of an opportunity, because if a few actors can screw and change the whole system, well, why can't we screw it back?
Well, thank you. And yet in Brussels, immediately after COVID and immediately after the war started against Ukraine, the reflex was we need to produce no matter what. We cannot afford to go into organic agriculture. We cannot afford not to use every square inch of land because we need to feed the world. That's the narrative often with European farmers. And no, you don't have to, because the world can feed itself. I'm looking at the audience. If you already have a burning question, raise your hand. We will have, after Ajay, the possibility to discuss for about 10 minutes. But now, Ajay, I'm happily coming to you, because you represent those who are not in the room, and you have been working all your life on the social inclusion and mobilizing farmers. So the floor is yours, Ajay.
Thank you, Martin. First, let me tell you, it's quite unnerving to be on a big screen behind you, looking at the audience where every expression is being checked. But congratulations on a very comprehensive report, which captures the essence of issues around transformation of food systems. And thank you to the organizers for having a farmer on the panel, so we have a voice here. The report has many pertinent observations, but for us farmers, what finds resonance is the part that food systems are a source of structural poverty, where incidences tend to be higher in agriculture than in other segments of food systems. And sitting in India, I'd like to talk about, in context to India and other developing nations, where a large percentage of the people are dependent on farming and have very small land holding. I believe that it is not possible to farm within planetary boundaries in a way that allows producers to fetch a life of dignity from higher incomes from just this profession. Now, I'll explain this with specifically to India. Is the priority for India and other nations remains today and in future will be to mitigate food inflation, which increasingly comes by driving down farm gate prices artificially. Second, as Rockström just said, consumers aren't ready to pay a higher price for quality food. So we can increase farm incomes, because that would incentivize farmers to transform to better systems. And that increase comes possibly from only three options. One is to increase productivity, second is to lower input costs, and third is to increase farm gate prices. But considering that majority of farmers in India own less than 1 hectare of land, hypothetically, even if a combination of all three was possible, it would not substantially increase household incomes for producers to meet daily expenses required to live a life of dignity. So what I'm trying to arrive at is that for a transformation, successful transformation to happen in developing countries like India, we need to improve livelihoods. And that means, in addition to increasing incomes, the public sector needs to invest directly vast sums of money, resources to deliver universal basic services like world-class healthcare, education, public transport, drinking water, crops, health insurance, crop insurance at rock bottom prices. And this will allow space for politicians to repurpose farm and food subsidies, ensuring sustainable agriculture practices. And before I end, this has context to global agriculture. If you see the highly confrontational nature of policy debates on repurposing agriculture support comes from fear of loss of incomes. Protests are happening today in Germany, in France, even in India and other places. We farmers are petrified of climate change impact on our incomes. Big businesses squeezing us out, scientists, governments, think tanks, philanthropists, and urban classes attempting to impose how we should be growing our food, and finally, not having us on the table. This, for me and those I represent who are not here in the room, as you, Martin, said, remains our #1 priority. Thank you.
Ajay, thank you very much. I'm standing up, so I'm seeing whether there are any requests for the floor. It's not every day that you have the possibility to ask such a high-level panel. There is a question over there, and I'm looking for your hands while the gentleman takes the floor.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Peter Fein. I'm Professor of Agriculture and Food Policy here at Humboldt University at Berlin. First of all, congratulations. Excellent and extremely important. Three very short remarks. The first of them are to Johan Rockström. You mentioned that rising prices and internalization of external costs will benefit producers. That work is these external costs. In the first instance, this increase costs to producers. And I was wondering what's the economics behind your remark. Second comment on the reform trajectory of the CAP. What we are seeing here is that we've got a lot of instruments that look as if they promote pro-environmental sustainable behaviors, but actually they are just ways of repackaging farm income support, which are very ineffective. So I think we've got a trap here of what I would call as-if reforms. And I was wondering whether you've got any suggestions how we can move beyond that. And my third concern is about the international system. I think we are currently moving towards a highly competitive, if not hostile, international system. Many of the recommendations in today's presentations require a cooperative international system to create institutions for collaborative international government. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic here, but I was wondering whether the Commission had any ideas how the recommendations here, the kinds of policies that you're suggesting, can succeed in the kind of international environment that we are currently facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. I would again collect some questions. Yeah, the lady over here, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Elizabeth Markiewicz. I have nothing to do with all of you because I don't come from your world, but I work with visual artists, video artists, where we're trying to change the narrative of your profession, basically in climate and environmental, because I think that there is one thing that you all should maybe think of, is that all your data is absolutely necessary, but it doesn't talk to people like me. We need narratives, like Mrs. Bezerra was saying, and we need visual stories. So that was my first comment. The second thing is that Mr. Rockström was talking about, and my neighbor also, about increasing the value of the food, which I would agree. I would just add that we should explain why, because then you would give better food, meaning you would give better nutrients to people, and they would need to eat less. Because the problem with bad food is that you eat more, you eat all the sugar with it and everything, but if you eat good food, you would do things. And the third thing I wanted to say is that Mrs. Stella, I forgot her last name, was talking about we still need to make research to prove the benefits of plant-based food. I'm a bit surprised by that because I have the feeling that we have all the scientific evidence now with functional medicine or even RNA research for precision nutrition are for me a pure evidence that we need to eat better to be healthy. I can tell you I'm a living example. Since 30 years I didn't have a flu, a cold, no COVID, nothing, and I have a very high, immune system. So I can tell you it works. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're saying that exactly in the season. The last question in this round goes to Alexander. Alexander, if you would also introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot. My name is Alexander Müller. I'm coming from their world. I'm working since 25 years in the machine room of food, agriculture, energy, and governance science. Congratulations to the report. It's really good to see that there's a growing body of evidence about the high externalities of food systems. Please don't ignore what FAO has done last year in the SOFA report 2023. They came up with similar figures. Use your report to reinforce the debate in FAO, otherwise it will be forgotten and they will go back to business as usual. My question is, can we agree on 3 steps? What do we have to do tomorrow to translate the findings into concrete policies? And here I would like to first start with the very nice sentence of Marilia Bezerra: let us not hide behind "it's not easy." If it would be easy, it would have been done. It's highly complex, and therefore we have to be strategic and identify, as I think in the global north, 3 processes where true cost accounting needs to be applied. It's the 7-year financial framework of the European Union. It's not easy, but it's about 350 billion euros over 7 years subsidies for the agriculture. And in parallel, the Farm Bill in the US. If we don't change it in the global north, we don't get traction in development cooperation. Second, can we learn from transformations that have already taken place? Energy revolution, the change from fossil fuels to renewables. It is not perfect here in Germany, but we can learn the lessons how a combination of regulation, dialogue, very clear directed guided subsidies have led to a change from 3% renewable electricity to 50%. It's far from being perfect, but what are the common denominators that we can do, that we can change it? And last but not least, Johan, you made an important point. We are currently observing a huge transformation of food systems in the wrong direction. What is going to happen in Africa over the next 5 to 10 years, led by AGRA and other institutions, means killing traditional and resilient systems and replacing them by systems with these very high externalities. So if we don't stop the transformation in the wrong direction first, we never can make a convincing case that we have to go in the opposite direction. It was too long. I can see it, Martin, in your face. Thanks a lot.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you. Maybe I would also ask Stella just to come on stage, because one question was directly directed to you. Maybe I start with Marilia. There was the question about the narratives, translating that into non-expert language, getting not only the minds, but the heart of people. I have you first, and then I would come, Johan, to you, since a couple of questions were directed to you. Stella on the question of plant-based foods. Marc, I would come to you on how to move Brussels and the 7-year plan. And then Ajay, I think this point of moving to Western diets, being in the wrong diet, goes as last point to you. But Marilia, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you. And wow, so many good comments and questions. Yes, is the answer. Yes, we do need to. I mean, we say data doesn't move hearts, stories do, right? However, you know, strong stories are made of facts and are strengthened by facts and by data. So we do have a mission in front of us. And I think I want to tag that to the other question about collaboration, what we do, what are the immediate steps, how do we make this happen? And I think that there's a few things that we can do right here in this room that might have positive, kind of put us in a positive direction of this big monumental task. I think the first one is step away from that narrative of impossibility, right? The report is a very powerful tool in that. The second one is I think an important one, which is recognizing that no one here is going to drive systems change. There's not one actor that is big enough, cool enough, rich enough to drive systems change. Systems change is collective work. And as collective work that it is, it means that we need to be getting together with partners at every level. So right here, right now, how do we create, depending on where we are, right? How do we create spheres of action and influence, right? How do we find the kindred spirits? How do we find the people who are up for the battle with us, to go in the trenches with us? And we build and we model what it looks like to step into this journey. Right? And also perhaps it's helpful to not think about it as the you know, that very far away moment in the future when we're going to get there, but actually to just think about this a long journey we must take, or else talk about not easy. Not easy is to lose 70% of our species to, you know, biodiversity loss. Not easy is to not have food. Not easy is to die. So I think about, yes, tell stories, use the information, the data, so no one can tell us it's impossible. Now we can say it's not impossible. Create your, understand that systemic shift is a collective action, and create your spheres of influence and action, and let them multiply, let them, you know, this is an emergent process. No one here holds all the pieces of what it takes to make this happen. So create those connections, let's build it from there, and let's think about it as a journey.
Thank you, Marilia. A long journey and very, very little time. Johan, to the question.
Yeah, so thanks, Peter. So that's a really important question. And so let's assume that you introduce a tax on nitrogen and a tax on carbon, which let's, for simplicity, just assume that that kind of immediately overnight evens out the 25% or so price difference today between ecological food and conventional food in the German market today. You would simply get an immediate correction. How would that benefit the farmer, the German farmer? You're right that overnight it would of course not do that. It cannot be done overnight. So you would have, as Ravi pointed out, as FSEC points out, create some form of compensation scheme on the really short term. But it would send very strong incentives for rapid transitions away from diesel-driven tractors. Farmers can do that today already. Driving tractors through with HVO is done everywhere across Europe, and that would be competitive. The transition away from plow-based agriculture to build organic carbon in the soils would be a reduction in energy use and an immediate benefit. There's so much evidence that that can be done with more economic benefits, but also building carbon in the soil. So you get an ecosystem service there. And I think the whole taxation part would enable more investments in sustainable agricultural practices, which we know from quite a lot of studies gives more labor-intensive agricultural practices, which also can create more jobs in the rural sectors. That's a little bit more question marky, but at least that's, I think, what we also see increasingly on the horizon. So yes, on the absolute immediate, it's a bit of a shock for the transition, but I think on the longer term, I think there is a lot of evidence that it can actually provide some support in that transition.
Thanks very much. Stella, very, very briefly, do we know enough about plant-based food?
Yes, so I would agree with you that looking at what is a healthy diet and what are the benefits of a healthy diet is not the main place where we should focus our research to drive food system transformation. We do know a lot about what a healthy diet looks like. It's a diverse category. There are many options within that, but certainly plant-based diets are one option of a healthy diet, and nearly all healthy diets include a lot of diverse types of plants. Where I would say that we need to focus when it comes to evidence generation is how do we actually get people to eat those diets, right? Another thing that we know very well is that currently we're a really long way from the majority of the population eating a healthy diet, and we don't know enough about how to close that gap. So we know some policies that work, but we know that implementing them is not going to take us all the way there. So where we need research is to understand how do we actually bring about that shift, get more people to adopt healthy diets.
Thanks very much, Marc. One of Alexander's 3 points was long-term plans in the European Union. How do we move the monster?
Well, obviously, I can't speak on behalf of the European Union. Look, I think one of the things that's very clear that farmers are saying at the moment in the debate around agriculture in the EU is that they're spending more time being paper workers than they are farming. Now, a lot of these agricultural subsidy-related systems have become incredibly complex. The number of forms that need to be filled, the number of reports that need to be written. So one of the things that we absolutely need to do is to reduce the complexity of these systems, because we just keep on building more and more systems on top of each other, right? And within that, we keep on having policies that are counterintuitive, but also run against each other. So it's time to clean up the paperwork and reduce the complexity. The second point, which Ajay referred to, is don't go at this discussion with, we're going to take your incomes away. Because guess what? All of those farmers now have no interest whatsoever in engaging with you, right? Heroes to zeros. It's all our fault. We're ruining all the water. We're ruining all the land. We're doing all these bad things. And now you're going to ruin our incomes. This is not a way to engage with that stakeholder group. And the last point I'd make on that, which I think is an interesting one, is this issue of sticks and carrots and how well they actually move in systems. And looking at another system, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, for $9 billion of taxpayer money, mobilized $35 billion in 9 months. And it wasn't even through financing. It wasn't even through grant financing. It was through tax breaks. This was money that companies would get later. It wasn't even money that was being pushed out the door. To take it back to the EU context, I think there's a real issue here, which is that the European development model has been one that has been based on grants and cheapened finance. And at the moment, it looks really difficult how you actually get to that horizon. Because if we just take energy efficiency, current available financing, about 12 billion euros. The bill that Europe faces, 138 billion euros to do full energy efficiency. You can't grant your way out of the transition in the agricultural system. We're going to need to work on how we actually incentivize farmers, we incentivize money, and that we enable capital to flow.
Thanks very much, Marc. Last question to Ajay. We see a food system transformation, but in the wrong direction. Western diets becoming the staple diets of people all over the planet. Is that what you see in India as well? How do we change that? What does that mean in your context?
Yes, we do see that in India, and I think we need to start taxing unhealthy foods. It's come out of the UN Food System Summit reports. It's come out in a lot of reports. We need to tax food, oil, salt, sugar, and fat. But Martin, I want to, as a farmer from the developing world, I need to put the report. I want to comment on a part of the report which rightly recommends to reduce trade barriers for crops, livestock, and secondary products. I would want to add a nuance to this argument by saying this can only happen subsequent to addressing the faulty WTO subsidies paradigm that exists. Agriculture subsidies in the developed world are artificially driving down farm gate prices for farmers in nations which cannot afford to subsidize farmers. And this drives millions into poverty. And this also doesn't allow a transformation to happen. So we need to be addressing all sorts of issues in greater detail. And the last point I want to say, which needs to be addressed, is that fertilizer cartels, commodity firms jacking up prices, increasing cost of production. And in the COVID years, we've seen invasion, and the recent invasion of Ukraine, we've seen the role of financialization of commodity markets. These all need to be addressed in future communications because they add to a cost of not allowing the food systems to transform. So we need to make sure that we discuss these issues also. Thank you so much for having farmers on the panel.
Ajay, thank you very much indeed. We will have, after the session, which will be closed by Ottmar Edenhofer in a second, a bit of finger food outside, so there will be ample possibility to continue the conversations. But first, join me in thanking this wonderful panel for a great discussion, and I would ask Ottmar Edenhofer to join us on the stage. So we were speaking about 3 co-chairs of FSEC, Ottmar Edenhofer, a Jedi of food system transformation, if I may say, is the third one. The floor is yours and the microphone as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be part of this project, and let me highlight a few very simple things. First, the most important message of this report is that the costs of action are smaller than the costs of inaction, or you could say the benefits of the transformation are larger than the costs of the transformation. So this sounds quite good, But again, the problem is, why do we not see any kind of transformation or transition which is consistent with the goals and the aspirations which are aligned with the Paris Agreement? And I would say an important answer to that is the costs of the transformation are concentrated and the benefits are dispersed. So the costs today have to be borne by powerful people, and the costs are in the future. The costs are in other parts of the world. So in that sense, it's a very tricky thing to do, but it is very important to understand what does it mean when we say we do not take into account all the relevant costs in our calculations. This sounds a very dry economic thing, but it is very fundamental. If we ignore costs, if we do not take into account all the social costs of our food system, this basically means we destroy assets and we destroy capital. And this is not just about physical capital. We in particular destroy human capital and we destroy natural capital. What we need is a much better understanding of what some people call inclusive wealth. And if we ignore the costs, if we do not take into account the full social costs of our system, this basically means we destroy wealth. And this is very important because when I speak to policymakers always feel when we talk about then taxes and redirecting subsidies, they say, oh my God, you put an additional burden on us, an additional cost of us. You make all things more complicated, more expensive. No, that's not true. If we ignore costs, we destroy wealth and we undermine capital and assets. And this is what economics is all about. We have to make sure that in the end we create sustainable wealth, inclusive wealth, and internalizing all the social costs, taking all the social costs into account is a way to create wealth for all. So this is important. And to send this message, again, it's not a new message, it's an old one, but not all messages are bad. Sometimes old messages are very good. And this is in particular appropriate to do this in Berlin. In Berlin, we saw a system which deliberately ignores some important scarcities. And the system completely failed. And I think it is very important that we convince the public, the policymakers, that taking into account all the social costs is just to secure wealth. Now, the last reflection is, to whom speaks the FSEC report? Of course, the FSEC report should speak to the public, to the NGOs, and also to the private sector. But I think this FSEC report should speak in particular to governments. And what I would like to do is, it's not in the report. I'm leading the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change. And this is a group of academics where we have the task and the mandate to propose climate targets for 2040. Next week, the Commission will publish a communication to what extent they will take into account our recommendation. And last week, we published a policy and a progress report where we evaluate, so to say, the current pathways of the European Commission and the European Union towards carbon neutrality. And what we find out is that we are very well aligned with the 2030 target, but after 2030, we are far away from achieving our targets. And in particular, we have identified one sector, the agricultural sector. In the agricultural sector, we see stable emissions since 2005, and we see in Europe declining carbon sinks. And in that sense, I would say, if this report speaks to the European Union, it speaks also to our board, because we will publish a report on CDR and agriculture over this year. I think this is a very important message the report entails. And here, I would like to highlight a few aspects for Europe, which seems to me are quite important. First, it is essential that we start to price emissions in the agricultural sector. This is hard to do, but there is no way to avoid this pricing emissions in the agricultural sector. Secondly, very important, we have to reward carbon sinks. A farmer who supplies carbon sinks should be rewarded. We need a fundamental subsidy reform in Europe. We need more information and we need appropriate compensation schemes. And we have to figure out how to do this and how to embed the common agricultural policy along these lines. And the last thing I would like to mention, there was a question about international cooperation. I fully agree. International cooperation is important for the transformation of the food system. International cooperation is decisive for solving the climate problem. But here I would, and I fully agree that we are not in a very comfortable situation, but I would like to convey at least a few very positive signs and very positive developments. Before COP, the European Union has announced they will implement a kind of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is a terrible acronym. It says basically somebody who will import carbon-intensive products to the European Union, they have to pay a tariff, something like this. So you can discuss this in very technical details to what extent the CBAM is good or bad. But at least this CBAM has sent a strong signal to other countries to think about carbon pricing. India is now discussing about a national carbon tax. Turkey has discussed or is in the process of discussing a national emissions trading scheme. And there are a few other countries contemplating. And I met many delegations in the COP in Dubai where they officially, we are absolutely against this European CBAM, but unofficially, this is a very good thing because this helps us to promote climate and agricultural policy domestically. So in that sense, I would say there are encouraging signs. And I would say many people have to come together in a cooperative way to make this transformation happen. But I would say we are here in Berlin, very close to Brussels. The European Union has to play an important role, and I hope so the European Union will do this in the next few months. So let me conclude with thanking a fantastic group and fantastic people at EAT, at FOLO, and also the modelers and the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research and the Secretariat. So without them, we wouldn't succeed. The last thing I would like to highlight here is, so we are here in Berlin, and here we are exactly in this room, in the Elinor Ostrom room, in the Elinor Ostrom Hall. So Elinor Ostrom, from my point of view, is a real hero, because Elinor Ostrom has shown us that people are able to deal with local commons. Our task today is to deal with the global commons. And here we have a quote, and this quote says basically very simple: institutions should bring out the best of people. When we do a better governance, when we set the incentives right, it's not just we change the behavior of people, we can bring out the best of people, and this is the best what we can hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Ottmar Edenhofer. I have just half a sentence to add. If you come out to your right, there is some food. Thank you.